The smell hits you first. Not the copper of blood. Not yet. Something older. Something that has been burning for days. You are standing on a ridge in Boeotia. The year is 479 before the Common Era. Late summer. The air should be sweet with harvest. Instead, it tastes of ash. Below you stretches a plain, flat, golden, endless. And covering that plain like a stain on linen are tents, thousands of them, tens of thousands. More soldiers than you have ever seen in your life. More soldiers than most Greeks believed existed in the world. This is the Persian army. They have been here for weeks, waiting, eating everything, burning what they cannot eat. The fields are black now. The farmhouses are shells. The wells have been poisoned with the bodies of livestock. Look closer at those tents. Look at the colors. Purple from Tyre, gold thread from Babylon, silks that cost more than your village earns in a decade. This is not just an army. This is an empire on display. And at its center stands a man named Mardonius. He is the cousin of the great king. He is the commander of 300,000 souls. He has been given one task: finish what Thermopylae started. Remember Thermopylae. Remember the 300 Spartans. Remember how the world whispered their names like prayers. Mardonius remembers too. He was there when news reached the Persian court. He watched King Xerxes weep with rage. He heard the vow that Greece would be erased from the earth. Now Xerxes has sailed home. The great king has left his best general behind with his best troops and his simplest orders. Kill them all, spare nothing. But something has gone wrong. For 11 days Mardonius has waited on this plain. For 11 days he has watched the Greek army gather on the hills above him. For 11 days neither side has moved. Think about that. 300,000 Persians, 80,000 Greeks, and nobody is fighting. Why? Because both sides know what happens next will decide everything. This is not fiction. This happened. This is the story of how Greece avenged its dead and shattered the greatest empire the world had ever known in a single afternoon. But before you understand what happened at Plataea, you need to understand what Persia had already taken. 1 year before this moment, Athens burned. Not in battle, in abandonment. The Athenians fled their city rather than surrender it. They loaded their women and children onto ships and sailed for the island of Salamis. And they watched from the water as Persian soldiers set fire to everything they had built. The Acropolis, the temples, the homes where their grandparents had been born. All of it, gone. The smoke rose so high it could be seen from Corinth. Then came Salamis, the naval battle that broke the Persian fleet. Xerxes watched his ships burn from a golden throne on the shore, and when dawn came, he began his retreat. But he did not retreat alone. He left Mardonius behind with the core of his army, the immortals, the cavalry, the archers who could blot out the sun. This was not defeat. This was strategy. Xerxes would return to Persia to rebuild his fleet. Mardonius would hold Greece until the ships returned. Then they would finish this together. That was the plan. The Greeks knew this. They knew that one battle had not ended the war. They knew that the monster had lost a limb, but kept its heart. So they did something unprecedented. They united. If this story grips you, drop a like and subscribe. Here we unearth the chapters history tried to bury. Sparta sent 5,000 of its own citizens. Not helots, not allies. Spartans. The largest Spartan army ever to leave the Peloponnese. Athens sent 8,000 hoplites, men whose homes were ash, men with nothing left to lose. Corinth sent 5,000. Megara sent 3,000. Tegea, Sicyon, Troezen, Epidaurus. City after city sent what they had. The total force numbered somewhere between 80,000 and 110,000 men, depending on whose chronicle you trust. This was the largest Greek army in history. and it was led by a Spartan named Pausanias. Remember that name. Write it on your mind in letters of bronze. Pausanias was not a king, he was a regent. The true king was a child named Pleistarchus, son of Leonidas. Yes, that Leonidas, the one who died at Thermopylae. Pausanias was Leonidas's nephew, and now he stood where his uncle had fallen. This was not coincidence. This was not politics. This was blood calling to blood. The Greeks took position on the northern slopes of Mount Cithaeron. They had the high ground. They had water from the springs. They had supply lines running south through the passes. Mardonius had the plain. He had numbers. He had cavalry that could move faster than any Greek formation. And so began the waiting. 11 days. Each dawn, the Greeks expected attack. Each dawn, the Persians held their line. Why did Mardonius not simply charge? He had 3 times the men. He had archers who could shoot while riding at full gallop. He had momentum, but he also had a problem. Greek hoplites in formation were nearly impossible to break. Their bronze shields overlapped. Their spears extended 8 feet forward. Cavalry could not penetrate. Arrows could not find gaps. The only way to beat a phalanx was to make it move. So Mardonius waited. He sent his cavalry to raid the Greek supply lines. He poisoned the Gargaphia spring that gave the Greeks their water. He intercepted a convoy of 500 pack animals coming through the passes. The Greeks were starving. The Greeks were thirsting. And still Pausanias would not come down from the hills. This was not cowardice. This was calculation. The Greek commanders knew something Mardonius did not. They knew their own weakness. They knew that this alliance was fragile. They knew that Spartans and Athenians had been enemies for generations. They knew that one wrong order could shatter everything. Their only chance was to make Persia come to them. So they waited. They suffered. They watched their men grow weak. And then on the 11th night everything changed. Mardonius received word from his scouts. The Greeks were moving, in the darkness, down from the hills. This was it. This was the moment. But what Mardonius saw as retreat was something else entirely. The night was moonless. That detail matters. The Greeks had chosen this night because the darkness would hide their movement. They were not retreating. They were repositioning. Pausanias had ordered a tactical withdrawal to a new defensive line closer to the town of Plataea. The springs there still flowed clean. The supply routes there were shorter. The ground there favored infantry. But something went wrong. The Greek army did not move as one. It fractured. The center contingents moved first. Corinthians, Megarians, small polis, nervous about being caught in the open. They marched too quickly and went too far. By dawn, they were scattered across the plain like seeds thrown by a careless hand. The Spartans did not move at all, not because they disobeyed, because of one man. His name was Amompharitus. He was a captain of one of the Spartan divisions, and when he received the order to withdraw, he did something unthinkable. He refused. A Spartan, refusing orders, in the field. Think about that. Amompharitus declared that Spartans did not retreat. Spartans did not run from barbarians. He would hold his position until dawn and face whatever came. Pausanias argued with him for hours, literally hours. The ancient sources describe shouting matches in the darkness, threats, pleas. Nothing moved Amompharitus. And so when the sun rose over Boeotia, the Greek army was not in formation. It was in pieces. The Athenians were on the left wing, isolated. The Spartans were still on the hillside, trapped by their own stubbornness. The center was gone, scattered toward Plataea. Mardonius saw all of this. He did not hesitate. The Persian cavalry swept forward like a wave. Behind them came the infantry, the Immortals, the Medes, the Bactrians, the Sacae. Arrows filled the sky. The first volley struck the Spartan formation while they were still trying to organize their shields. Men fell. Blood soaked the morning grass. Pausanias did not panic. He understood immediately what had happened. He understood that his careful plan had collapsed. He understood that his army was about to be destroyed in detail. But he also understood something else. This was the moment he had been waiting for. For 11 days, Pausanias had prayed for Mardonius to attack. For 11 days, he had watched his men suffer, hoping to draw the Persians into open battle. Now that battle had come. It had come at the worst possible moment, but it had come. Pausanias turned to his men. The ancient sources tell us he gave no speech. He simply raised his spear and pointed it at the enemy. Then he ordered the advance. The Spartans moved down the hillside, 5,000 of them, bronze shields locked, spears level, red cloaks streaming behind. They did not run. They walked, in perfect formation, into the teeth of the Persian arrows. Men fell with every step, 20 yards, 50, 100. Still they walked. The Persian archers could not understand it. They had fought Greeks before. They had seen hoplites break under sustained arrow fire. They had seen phalanxes crumble when the casualties mounted. These men did not break. These men were Spartans, and these Spartans remembered Thermopylae. Every man in that formation knew someone who had died at the hot gates. Brothers, fathers, cousins, friends. For a year, they had carried that grief like a stone in their chests. Now they were going to set it down. The two lines met. This was not chaos. This was a system. The Spartans struck the Persian front rank and carved through it. The wicker shields the Persians carried could not stop bronze-tipped spears. The short swords they wielded could not reach past 8-foot sarissas. It was butchery. But the Persians did not flee. This is where the story becomes complicated. This is where the sources diverge and the propaganda begins. But certain facts remain clear. The Persian infantry fought with desperate courage. They grabbed at the Greek spears with their bare hands. They threw themselves onto the blades. They died by the thousands, but they did not run. Mardonius himself led charge after charge. He rode a white horse so all could see him. He shouted commands in a language most of his men did not understand. He was trying to hold them together. It was not working. The battle had broken into 100 smaller fights. Here, a cluster of immortals holding a position. There, a band of Spartans pushing forward. Everywhere, blood and screaming and dust so thick men choked on it. And then Mardonius fell. A Spartan named Leonidas threw the stone that killed him. It struck Mardonius in the head and knocked him from his horse. The Persians saw their general fall. Something broke. This was not brutality. This was protocol. Eastern armies depended on their commanders in ways Greek armies did not. When the general died, the chain of command fractured. Officers did not know who to obey. Units did not know where to go. The Persian center collapsed. Men began to run, first in tens, then hundreds, then tens of thousands. They ran toward the stockade that Mardonius had built on the banks of the Asopus River. A wooden fort surrounded by a ditch, a place to regroup. The Spartans pursued. They had been walking into arrow fire for an hour. They had been fighting hand to hand for longer than that. They were exhausted and wounded and had watched their friends die all around them. They did not stop. They chased the Persians across the plain. They caught them before they reached the river. They killed them in the fields where their camps had been. Some Persians made it to the stockade, perhaps 40,000. They crowded inside and closed the gates and thought they were safe. They were wrong. The Spartans did not know how to conduct a siege. They had no ladders. They had no battering rams. They stood outside the wooden walls and screamed challenges that no one answered. And then the Athenians arrived. Remember the Athenians. They had been on the left wing fighting their own battle against the Thebans and other Greek collaborators. They had won that fight. Now they came to finish this one. The Athenians understood siege warfare. They had engineers. They had experience. They had something else too. Rage. These were men whose city had been burned. These were men who had watched everything they loved turn to ash. They went over the walls. What happened inside the stockade was not battle. It was execution. The ancient sources differ on the numbers. Herodotus claims that of 300,000 Persians, fewer than 3,000 survived the day. This is almost certainly exaggerated. The real number was probably lower. Perhaps 40,000 made it back to Asia. But the slaughter was real. The slaughter was documented. The slaughter was celebrated for centuries afterward. And it was not limited to Persian soldiers. When the Greeks captured the Persian camp, they found treasure beyond imagination. Gold, silver, tapestries, weapons inlaid with precious stones. They also found people, servants, slaves, concubines brought by Persian officers who expected to rule Greece from luxury. The sources do not tell us what happened to most of these people. They disappear from the record like water into sand. This was not war. This was industry. The Greeks divided the spoils according to ancient custom. 1/10 went to the gods. Pausanias dedicated a golden tripod at Delphi that stood for centuries. The rest went to the soldiers who had earned it. Every man who fought at Plataea became wealthy that day. But wealth was not what they were fighting for. The bodies lay in the sun for days. Nobody buried them immediately. The Greeks were too busy counting treasure. The Persians were too busy fleeing for their lives. So the dead waited. Crows found them first, then the dogs that had fled the burning farms, then the flies. By the time the burial details arrived, the stench was overwhelming. Men wrapped cloth around their faces and worked in shifts. They dug trenches and rolled bodies into them without ceremony. The Persians went into unmarked pits. The Greeks received something different. Pausanias ordered separate burial mounds for each contingent. The Spartans got theirs. The Athenians got theirs. The Tegeans got theirs. These mounds still exist. Travelers visited them for hundreds of years afterward. They left offerings. They said prayers. They traced the outlines of names carved into stone. The ancient writer Pausanias visited the site 600 years later. Different Pausanias, a travel writer. He described the tombs in detail. He noted which ones were genuine and which ones had been built later by cities that wanted to claim credit they had not earned. Even in antiquity, people understood the power of this place. This was where the tide turned. This was where the Greek world proved it could stand against the largest empire humanity had ever built. This was where history cracked in half. But understanding what happened at Plataea means understanding what did not happen. The Persians did not disappear after this battle. Their empire lasted another 150 years. They rebuilt their strength. They interfered in Greek politics constantly. They funded wars between Athens and Sparta. They watched the Greeks tear each other apart. And eventually they were conquered themselves. By Alexander. By a Macedonian king whose father had been born 30 years after Plataea. The wheel kept turning. But something had changed forever. Something in how Greeks saw themselves. Something in how they saw the world. Before Plataea, the Persian Empire seemed invincible. It had conquered everything it touched. Lydia, Babylon, Egypt, the Greek cities of Ionia. Resistance seemed not just futile, but insane. After Plataea, the Greeks understood something new. Empires could fall. This was not chaos, it was a system. A system that could be broken by men who refused to kneel. Think about what that knowledge meant. Think about what it meant for a farmer from Corinth who had spent his whole life assuming that someday Persian soldiers would march through his fields and take everything. Think about what it meant for an Athenian mother who had watched her city burn and wondered if her sons would grow up speaking Persian. Think about what it meant for a Spartan veteran who had trained his whole life for a war everyone assumed he would lose. These people went home different than they had left. They went home believing that the world could be changed, that history was not fixed, that small nations could stand against giants if they stood together. This belief shaped everything that came after. Athens built its democracy in the decades following Plataea. Not because democracy was inevitable, but because Athenians believed they had earned the right to govern themselves. They had paid for that right in blood. Sparta grew more isolated and more proud. The Spartans believed they had saved Greece. They believed this gave them special authority. This belief would eventually destroy them, but that destruction was generations away. In the immediate aftermath of Plataea, something else happened. Something the ancient sources mention only briefly, but which deserves attention. The Greeks pursued. The battle was over. The stockade had fallen. The Persian army was shattered. But Pausanias did not stop. He sent forces north. The remaining Persian troops were retreating toward the Hellespont, toward the bridges that could carry them back to Asia. If they reached those bridges, they might escape. Some did escape. The cavalry mostly. They could move faster than any Greek pursuit. By the time Pausanias organized his forces, the Persian horsemen were already 3 days ahead. But the infantry could not move so quickly. Wounded men, demoralized men, men who had thrown away their weapons to run faster. These men clogged the roads north like blood in a dying vein. The Greeks caught them. Again and again over the following weeks, small Greek forces intercepted columns of retreating Persians. The slaughter continued. The treasure continued to accumulate. Artabazus was one of the few Persian commanders who escaped with his forces intact. He had kept his men out of the main battle. When he saw Mardonius fall, he immediately began his retreat. His discipline saved perhaps 40,000 lives. The rest were not so fortunate. By the time the pursuit ended, the Persian presence in mainland Greece had been erased. This was not brutality. This was protocol. This was what happened when empires overreached. This was the price of invasion. And the Greeks wanted everyone to know it. Messengers carried news of the victory across the Greek world. Ships sailed to the colonies in Sicily and southern Italy. Riders galloped to the islands of the Aegean. Everywhere the message was the same. Persia had been broken. The 300 had been avenged. Greece was free. But even as those messengers spread their news, another battle was being fought. On the same day as Plataea, according to tradition, a Greek fleet attacked the Persian navy at Mycale, on the coast of Asia Minor. The same day. Historians have debated this coincidence for millennia. Did the battles really happen simultaneously? Or did the Greeks later synchronize the dates to create a more powerful narrative? We cannot know for certain. What we know is that at Mycale, the Greeks destroyed what remained of the Persian fleet. They burned the ships on the beach. They killed the marines who defended them. They liberated the Ionian Greek cities that had been under Persian rule for generations. By the end of that single day, the Persian threat to Greece had effectively ended. Not completely, not forever, but for a generation. This was enough. This was enough for the Greeks to build the world that came after. The world of philosophy and theater and democracy and conquest. The world that would shape everything we now call Western civilization. All of it rested on the bones buried at Plataea. All of it started with men who refused to run. Pausanias understood this. In the days after the battle, he did something unusual for a Spartan. He showed mercy. When the Greek allies captured a group of Thebans who had collaborated with Persia, they wanted to execute them immediately. Pausanias refused. He brought the collaborators back to Thebes and put them on trial. Some were executed after the trial, but the process mattered. Pausanias was trying to build something, not just win a battle. Build a Greece that could survive what came next. A Greece united by more than shared fear. He failed. Of course he failed. Within a generation, the Greeks were at each other's throats again. Athens and Sparta fought wars that killed more Greeks than Persia ever had. The unity of Plataea became a memory. Then a myth. But the myth mattered. For centuries afterward, when Greeks needed to remember what they could be, they remembered this. They remembered a day when farmers and merchants and aristocrats stood together against the greatest army on earth. They remembered that they won. The bones of the 300 were never recovered. This is something the poets do not mention. The heroes of Thermopylae died in a narrow pass defended by traitors. Their bodies were mutilated. Their remains were scattered. When the Greeks finally reclaimed the hot gates months later, there was nothing left to bury. So the Greeks at Plataea carried their memory instead. Pausanias had a message delivered to Mardonius before the battle. The ancient sources preserve it. The message was simple. You dishonored our dead at Thermopylae. We will repay that dishonor at Plataea. Think about what that means. This was not just a military campaign. This was a blood debt. This was an entire civilization telling an empire that some insults could not be forgotten. The Spartans remembered longest. They remembered because Leonidas had been their king. They remembered because Spartan identity was built on the idea that Spartans did not surrender. They remembered because every boy in Sparta for generations afterward was raised on stories of the 300. Those boys grew up and became the men who marched to Plataea. They did not march for territory. They did not march for trade routes. They did not march for political advantage. They marched for revenge. Modern historians sometimes try to explain Plataea in strategic terms. They talk about supply lines and cavalry tactics and alliance structures. All of this is true, but it misses something essential. The Greeks who fought at Plataea were driven by rage, pure rage. The kind of rage that makes men walk into arrow fire without flinching. The kind of rage that turns farmers into killers. Persia had invaded their homes. Persia had burned their temples. Persia had enslaved their cousins in Ionia. And Persia had killed the 300. This was not chaos. It was a system of vengeance as old as humanity itself. The Persians understood vengeance too. That is why they had returned after Salamis. That is why Xerxes had left Mardonius behind with orders to finish the conquest. Xerxes wanted revenge for Marathon. His father Darius had been humiliated there 10 years before Thermopylae. The Persian army had been driven into the sea by outnumbered Athenians. That defeat had haunted the Persian court for a decade. So Xerxes came to erase it. And when Salamis went wrong, he left Mardonius to erase it in his place. Vengeance answering vengeance, blood calling for blood. This is how wars become eternal. But Plataea broke the cycle, not because the Greeks were more virtuous, not because they found some higher path, because they won so completely that there was nothing left to avenge. The Persian army that died on that plain was the best Persia had. The immortals were gone. The cavalry were scattered. The treasury that Mardonius had brought to fund the occupation was now in Greek hands. Persia could rebuild. Persia would rebuild. But Persia would never again send an army into Greece. The mathematics simply did not work anymore. Any army large enough to conquer Greece would have to march overland through hostile territory. It would have to cross the Hellespont on bridges that Greek fleets could destroy. It would have to fight its way through passes that Greeks now knew how to defend. And at the end of all that marching and fighting and dying, it would face Greek hoplites in formation. Plataea proved what that meant. The Persian Empire had resources Greece could not match. It had population Greece could not match. It had wealth Greece could not imagine, but it could not beat a Greek phalanx in open battle. This was the lesson that echoed down the centuries. This was the lesson that Philip of Macedon studied when he built his army. This was the lesson that Alexander carried all the way to India. Infantry wins wars. Discipline beats numbers. Free men fight harder than slaves. These ideas were not proven at Plataea, but Plataea burned them into the Greek consciousness forever. The aftermath of the battle revealed something else about the Greek character, something darker. When the Greeks captured the Persian camp, they found the tent of Mardonius. This tent was legendary. It had belonged to Xerxes himself before he sailed back to Asia. It was woven from purple cloth and threaded with gold. The furniture inside was carved from ebony and ivory. The dishes were silver and bronze. Pausanias had his servants prepare a meal using Mardonius's own cooks and Mardonius's own ingredients. Then he had his Spartan cooks prepare a traditional Spartan meal. Black broth, barley bread, nothing more. He set the two meals side by side and invited the Greek commanders to look. "This is what they fight for," he said, "and this is what we fight for." The message was clear. Persian luxury made men soft. Spartan simplicity made men hard. The hard men had won. It was propaganda, of course, brilliant propaganda, but it was also a warning. Pausanias was telling his fellow Greeks what happened to people who lived like Persians. He was telling them that victory had not changed the fundamental rules. They did not listen. Within a decade, Pausanias himself was accused of living like a Persian, of wearing Eastern clothes, of plotting with the enemy, of betraying everything he had fought for. He died in disgrace, starved to death in a temple where he had taken sanctuary. His own people walled him inside and waited for him to stop breathing. This was not brutality. This was protocol. This was how Sparta dealt with those who forgot their place. The same fate awaited many who rose too high after Plataea. The Athenian commander Aristides was celebrated as the most just man in Greece. Within years, he was ostracized, sent into exile by the very democracy he had helped save. The Athenian Themistocles, architect of the victory at Salamis, fared even worse. He fled Greece entirely. He ended his life as a Persian satrap, governing a Greek city in Asia Minor. The men who saved Greece could not survive what Greece became. This pattern repeated throughout Greek history. Heroes rose. Heroes fell. The cities they saved turned on them with the same ferocity they had shown the enemy. Some historians see this as tragedy. Others see it as democracy working exactly as intended. The people who had fought together refused to be ruled by the men who led them. They had not defeated one empire to create another, or so they told themselves. The graves at Plataea still exist. They are not easy to find. The town itself has changed names multiple times over the millennia. The landscape has shifted with farming and development and the slow erosion of time. But the mounds remain. Modern archaeologists have studied them. They have found bones. They have found weapons. They have found pottery shards that match the dates the ancient writers gave. This happened. This is not legend dressed as history. This is not myth inflated by centuries of retelling. The Battle of Plataea was real. The men who fought it were real. The blood they spilled soaked into soil you can still walk on today. That reality matters. It matters because we live in an age that has grown suspicious of heroism. We have seen too many heroes revealed as frauds. We have learned to look for hidden motives behind every noble act. But sometimes the motives are exactly what they appear to be. The Greeks at Plataea fought for their homes. They fought for their families. They fought for revenge. These are not complicated motivations. These are not subtle. These are the same reasons people have fought since the first humans picked up stones and faced their enemies. What made Plataea different was the scale. 80,000 men from cities that had been rivals for generations put aside their differences and formed a single line. They held that line under conditions that should have broken them. They won a battle that should have been impossible. And then they went home. Most of them went home to lives that history does not record. They became farmers again, merchants again, fathers again. They told their children stories about the day they stood against the empire. Those stories passed down through generations. They reached writers like Herodotus, who collected them and shaped them and gave them the form we know today. But beneath all the shaping, something true remains. The memory of men who refused to kneel. This was not chaos. It was a system of resistance that human beings have rebuilt again and again throughout history. Every time an empire rises, it eventually faces a Plataea, a moment when the people it seeks to dominate simply refuse, a moment when the mathematics of power stop working. The Persian Empire learned this in 479 before the Common Era. Other empires learned it later. Some are learning it still. The lesson never changes. You cannot conquer people who would rather die than submit. You can kill them. You can burn their cities. You can scatter their bones across battlefields no one will remember. But you cannot make them yours. The 300 at Thermopylae understood this. They went to that pass knowing they would die. They went anyway. The 80,000 at Plataea understood it too. They formed their line knowing the numbers were against them. They fought anyway, and when the battle was over, they did not declare themselves rulers of the world. They did not march on Persia and claim its throne. They built their monuments and buried their dead and went back to arguing with each other. Because that was what being Greek meant. It meant choosing freedom even when freedom was messy and contentious and exhausting. It meant preferring chaos to someone else's order. This choice had consequences. The Greeks never built an empire that lasted. They spent the next century and a half fighting each other. They weakened themselves so badly that eventually Philip of Macedon conquered them all, and Philip's son, Alexander, used the army Philip built to finally destroy the Persian Empire forever. There is irony there. Dark irony. The Greeks won at Plataea only to lose their independence to a Macedonian king who styled himself as their champion. The victory that saved Greek freedom became a stepping stone to Greek subjugation. History rarely delivers clean endings, but the memory of Plataea survived. It survived Alexander. It survived Rome. It survived the long centuries when Greece was a province ruled by distant powers. The memory survived because it contained something people needed: hope. Hope that the powerful could be defeated. Hope that courage mattered. Hope that standing together could accomplish what standing alone could not. These are not Greek ideas. These are human ideas. Every culture that has ever faced conquest has produced its own stories of resistance, its own Thermopylaes, its own Plataeas. The specifics change, the weapons change, the names change, the truth remains. Silence is not erasure. The men who died at Plataea have been dead for 25 centuries. Their names are mostly lost. Their faces are unknown. The languages they spoke have evolved beyond recognition. But what they did still echoes. Every time someone refuses to submit to power they do not recognize as legitimate, they walk in the footsteps of the men who formed that line on the Boeotian plain. Every time a small nation stands against a larger one, it draws on the same well of defiance. This is the real victory of Plataea. Not territory, not treasure, not even revenge. The real victory was proving that such victories were possible. The 300 died at Thermopylae so that Greece would have time to prepare. The 80,000 won at Plataea so that the sacrifice of the 300 would mean something. And we remember both because we need to believe that our own sacrifices might mean something too. If this story moved, you consider subscribing. We trace the battles that broke empires and the choices that built civilizations. Leave a comment telling us what you want uncovered next. There are more stories buried in history waiting for someone to dig them out.